Hello, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks, Chair of CMC's Board of Trustees and President of Hannah News Service here in Columbus. It's great to see you. Metro Club live streaming is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation and in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. We'd like to thank all of our sponsors, and especially those of you watching today who have purchased a virtual seat for this forum. We are very grateful for your support and are able to continue live streaming services in large part because of you. Thank you. You can learn more about CMC, register for events, join or renew your membership, or make a donation anytime at columbusmetroclub.org. A new presidential administration began on Wednesday with the inauguration of Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Change is in the air. The future of the GOP, the future of our nation, and a long road of health and economic recovery lies ahead. Points of view are many, and we look forward to a robust conversation when the experts share their thoughts in today's forum beyond inauguration. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. Sandy Theis, owner of Theis Research and Consulting. Herb Asher, Ph.D., OSU Professor Emeritus, Political Science. Terry Casey, Republican Strategist and Commentator. Ray Miller, publisher, Columbus and Dayton African American News Journal, and our host, news anchor at WBNS 10 TV, Tracy Townsend. Tracy, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk a little action happening on Wednesday. Big day, big day. I love the inauguration. I feel like it is truly a celebration of the democracy, no matter how you voted. And I just love to see all of the history as it plays out. And wow, for students, they learned a lot if they were paying attention. If you're in an AP history class, you learned a lot about how that all works, should work, could have worked. We saw a lot of different things there. So I did think it was a great inauguration. I will go on record as saying that. We watched that wall-to-wall coverage. It was really quite spectacular. A lot of history made there, and that's really where I thought we could start today. I'm going to start with you, Professor. What do you think? What were some of the historic standout moments of the inauguration on Wednesday?
Well, I thought, given what had transpired a week or two before, and what was transpiring from Election Day to the inauguration, and the resistance of the former president to acknowledge the legitimacy of the election and even of our democracy, I thought the inaugural day turned out perfectly. The most common words I heard from friends is when the day ended with pride and peace and tranquility, they said, I can breathe again. There was really, my blood pressure is going down. And that's a commentary, because imagine that we were so worried about what might happen. So I thought it was an excellent day, and I thought two things really helped President Biden's inaugural address. It was actually very good that President Trump did not show up, because if he had shown up, the photographers and the cameras and the TV would have been actually photographing him, and we'd be seeing him on the screen. What is his reaction to words like truth and things like that? And we didn't need that. And it was also, obviously we didn't have any crowds on the mall for reasons both of security and because of COVID. But I thought what that did is it gave Biden the opportunity to talk to really a small audience. And he didn't have to worry about being interrupted by thousands and thousands of people cheering. And it made his speech seem more like a sermon. It made it seem more like a value-laden statement about who he is and what the country is and where we need to go. And I thought that made it very, very effective as his first major statement being president. The very fact that we had the symbols that day, Republicans. The gift exchange at the, the Capitol was wonderful. And, there was so much going on to try to suggest that we are one country. We know we have many problems. We're going to be talking about that. But I thought the inaugural day really captured, and much better than many of us thought could happen, that we are one nation.
Terry, Casey, you want to?
Yeah.
Let's just go down the row on this
Oh,
first,
okay.
and we'll jump in. Terry, you start.
Well, as I predicted a week ago, I did the WOSU Columbus on the Record show, and I predicted things would be smooth. Now we're to what I call the main event, which is how do we sort out the politics and the policy, and how do you define unity? How does it really work? And in today's New York Times, Peter Baker, their very respected chief White House correspondent, raised the question that Republicans and Democrats are not united on unity. He noted that Republicans want to see the tangible concessions that supposedly are promised or implied. Democrats, many of them, are in no mood to compromise. There's a question, we don't have a bipartisan cabinet as we did under Obama, George W. Bush, or Clinton. So the question is, words in an inaugural are nice. The question is, what's the real policy? What's the real actions? What happens next? Because one of the key points, America is still very closely divided. The Senate is 50-50. You look at state capitals, state legislatures across America, the margins for Nancy Pelosi shrunk up. So we've still got a very divided country, and the question is, where do we go from here? I think that's the main thing. Again, inaugurals and Lady Gaga's dress is nice, and the large pin she wore, that's all cute and interesting to talk about. But now we're down to the serious business of where do we go on policy? What does unity really mean?
All right. So fashion to focus. Sandy, you next.
We can't overlook the historical significance of having our first woman vice president who's a woman of color. And America is finally starting to confront its racist past. It's a painful conversation. It's going to be a long conversation. But seeing Kamala Harris, who is ridiculously qualified for her job, and seeing President Biden pick a cabinet that looks more like America than any cabinet we've ever seen was amazing to me. And my daughter has a daughter, and she sent me a picture of her daughter wearing her Ruth Bader Ginsburg T-shirt that Grammy Sandy bought for her in front of the TV with Kamala being sworn in. And little girls across America saw that, and that really warmed my heart.
It really was.
Well, Tracy, I think what framed the inauguration in a dynamite kind of a way was Amanda Gorman,
Yes.
the young 22-year-old poet from Los Angeles, when she recited the poem that she spent quite a bit of time writing, The Hill We Climb.
Yes.
And I just want to lift up one verse. I almost sounded like a pastor when I said one
did.
verse
You did.
as opposed to one sentence. But Amanda Gorman said, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. I think there's so much within that. As we talk about all of the disparities that exist, whether we're talking about disparities, racial disparities with COVID, whether we're talking about all of the issues that President Biden addressed just yesterday with all of the executive orders around economic opportunity, around equality and justice and so forth, those kinds of executive orders that were raised up. I think she framed it so powerfully, and I totally agreed with Sandy. To have a person of color as the vice president of the United States now, after having had for 2 terms an African-American president, followed by one of the worst presidents, I would say followed by the worst president in the history of the world, not just America. And that may be a little hyped. Terry probably is going to fall off of his
Terry out of the corner of my eye. I was like,
little
oh, boy.
stool over there. But I think Amanda Gordon framed the inauguration and the future for America in a very powerful way. And we'll talk more about Kamala Harris later.
I love the picture of Barack Obama and Kamala Harris greeting each other. I thought that was quite symbolic of sort of this turning point in our country. Can we talk about the first executive orders? Terry brought up the focus, the action. Do you think that the executive orders that President Biden signed, is that a signal of where he's going to start?
Well, President Biden has a real tough challenge of how much does he go to the Democrat base in satisfying things they want. Example, the Keystone Pipeline immediately axed 11,000 jobs, a lot of them union members, construction. There's other things on the COVID that are certainly good and understandable, but even the New York Times today, again, quoting the New York Times, not a right-wing publication, said basically his plan for 100 million vaccinations in the next 100 days is pretty similar to what the plan was before he became president. So clearly there's problems in states and localities that need to be worked out and solved. But the question is, and again, there's the whole looming thing of impeachment. And to my knowledge, we've never had an impeachment to remove a president who's not president. And so there's some serious constitutional legal questions and a political question. How much time and capital do you spend on fighting that when maybe the Senate ought to be focused on other things?
Professor.
The executive orders certainly made a lot of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party happy. And those were disposed of very quickly. And now we're to really the point of governing and legislating. And I see the three most immediate problems for the country: the economic problems and suffering that's going on, and certainly the COVID vaccine. And I also think it's extremely important that we get kids back into schools. And people aren't talking about that enough. But in fact, all three of those issues get tied up in the very first COVID relief package that, in fact, the president has talked about already, with a price tag of $1.9 trillion and all of that. But these aren't things. We'll know pretty quickly whether we're going to have an opportunity to move that through the Congress very quickly. This is not something that you spend 6 months getting economic relief to people. This is not something that you spend 3 or 2 months improving our ability to distribute vaccines and administer them and all of that. And you don't have a lot of time, although the second semester in primary and secondary schools has already begun, but the issue of the kids in schools and real in-class learning. So I think we'll get a sense here, and there's a group of, I think 12 or 15, 16 senators already working on this in a bipartisan fashion.
And in the interest of unity, I'm going to agree with Herb's 3 top priorities. So if Herb and I were running things, we could get a lot done.
Well, I think those are the president's top priorities, and they're the country's top. Those are the immediate things. So, look, there are a lot of other things we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about social justice and racial healing, and concerns about cybersecurity and domestic terrorism. But the most immediate things are these. And there's a vehicle, there's a piece of legislation, and I'm sure there are negotiations going on right now.
It's going to be interesting to see the posture of the Republicans, because they're suddenly deficit hawks again. They were fine ringing up the deficit when it was tax cuts for millionaires, but now that people are dying and people are hungry and people are homeless through no fault of their own, and it was worsened by the conduct of the previous president, suddenly the Republicans are worried about ringing up the deficit. And I think that's just a tragedy. All the economists have said we need to go big for this to really be meaningful, and we should learn from what happened during the Great Recession when we scaled things back and we stalled the recovery. So Herb's right. We're going to figure out relatively soon whether or not Mitch McConnell's going to continue to draw a line in the sand. And we know from history that if you give him an inch, he wants more room, and he's going to elbow you along the way to get it.
I think it's really important to keep in mind the background, the experience, the track record of President Biden. I had the good fortune of serving on the White House staff of President Carter, and I would leave my office on the west side of the White House and go through the old executive office building to many of the staff meetings. And so we had to pass Walter Mondale's office. And Mondale really didn't have anything to do. Mondale would sit there and he would complain, and he would see me pass and he would say, "Ray, come in," and because he didn't really have anybody to talk with him. And Joe Biden really doesn't come from that kind of background. After having served for decades in public life and in the United States Senate, and enjoying politics to the extent that he really enjoys politics. We had presidents who really didn't want to sit down and talk with members of Congress or the United States Senate. And presidents that some of us really, really liked, but that wasn't his shot. He would not go over and sit down. Biden's the kind of person who says, if I can't come and see you, how about you coming over to see me? It's an open kind of a process, right? It's not even a process. It's just old friends getting together, or new young guys and young women who he would enjoy talking with. So when you're trying to work out public policy, we all know this. When you're trying to develop public policy, you've got to be open to conversation. You've got to lay back. You've got to get a chance to know Sandy Theis. Sandy is not the easiest person sometimes to get to know. But after 5 or 10 minutes, then I see what her principles and her beliefs are and so forth. So he's bringing to the office of the presidency what we have not had
In 4 years.
In 40 years.
Because that's what we all talked about is the old school politics of we had dinner, but it seems like in the past 4 years there's a lot of name calling. You're in your camp, I'm in my camp, and we're not going to talk. And so now we do have to talk about how that could shape policy and what's ahead.
I think Ray is exactly right, but that we have a president who has the personal and the political skills and experience to try to make a breakthrough here in trying to build coalitions. It may work, it may not, but I think he's probably the best person. The country lucked out in having Joe Biden be president at this point, given the challenges that are going on. And if anybody can work with the Republicans in the Senate, in a 50-50 Senate, it's Biden.
Right.
And I think there's some notion of reciprocity. We'll see whether McConnell really becomes a more willing player, if you will, rather than worrying about the 2022 elections already. But I think Ray's absolutely right that in this case, leadership and leadership approach and leadership style makes a difference.
Well, there
And
are already
I agree
reports
that-
that he's talking, that McConnell and Biden are talking. That's a kind of a return to old school.
Yes.
Well, they're talking, but I'll give you a specific policy example. Immigration is a very divisive issue, and it's divisive even among Republicans, it's among Democrats, because there's a lot of different views of where you go on that. And George W. Bush supported an immigration reform thing that had a lot of bipartisan support, but it never went anywhere. So the question is, how does he handle that? How do you bring the parties together, because there's some real significant differences. And part of it is which Joe Biden governs, because he's got, as Herb mentioned, a lot of super progressive people who have strong opinions about what they think it ought to go, and they really believe more in open borders. There's other people that have a different opinion, Democrat and Republican. So immigration's one issue. The question is, when he announced, "This is my plan," was that the right way to do it, or would it have been better to spend more time listening and figuring out a coalition and then putting together a unifying package? But there's a lot of divisive issues, and again, it's not just Republican versus Democrat, and immigration, I think, is one of the key examples.
Sandy, your face.
I think the good thing is times have changed, and it's just not the old boys, as Sandy referenced. Now you have a woman as the vice president, and she is not going to be marginalized. She's not going to sit over in some corner. Biden recognizes what he has in terms of her intellect, her reach, who she is as a person in terms of her mother as an Indian, her father as a person from Jamaica, and then her own, long experience of serving in public life as the Attorney General and all of that. He's got a real asset. And you can send her over to the Congress and to the United States Senate, and I'll bet you some things will change.
You agree, Sandy?
I do agree, and I think, I know people are impatient, and Terry would like better outreach to the other side. We're running out of time.
Why do you say that?
Homelessness went up even before COVID-19 struck. Unemployment, we've not yet recovered from the Great Recession, at least in Ohio. So we need to do something, and we need to do it pretty darn soon. And I think President Biden will get credit for trying. And if he is blocked by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, they're going to get the lion's share of the blame, because this is an equal opportunity crisis. A lot of people are hurting. And the only way to fix it is to put money in their pockets and get everybody vaccinated.
What does the future hold for the Republican Party? Terry, I'm going to let you answer that first. I'm going to let you go with that one.
Well, I love to bring back history, including 2009, when the Democrats had 60 senators, a supermajority in the House. They obviously controlled the White House. And in 2009, the media wrote about not only declaring the Republican Party dead, but had them buried with 50 cubic feet of concrete on top of them. But then, lo and behold, 2010, Republicans come back, gain control of the U.S. House. The Democrats were thrown out there, largely reaction to a lot of the things that President Obama and the Democrats did. In states like Ohio, John Kasich beat incumbent Ted Strickland in somewhat of an upset. So politics, and you can look back to other years, like after 1982 when the Democrats swept things, after 74 and Watergate. So people that declare one party or the other party dead tend to be people doing wishful thinking, and it generally doesn't happen that way. But again, policies and what you do or don't do makes a big difference in terms of things. So clearly, the economic recovery is key. COVID is key. A lot of these other issues. So people are going to be judged not on words said on an inaugural day, but what do they actually do? What do they get accomplished?
I don't think you can forget about, you can't have that discussion, Terry, without talking about the strategy of the Republican Party with regard to apportionment boards across America. It's like, if we control the redistricting process, and the Republicans said that, if we control the redistricting process, then we can change those majorities. It didn't just happen because there were good candidates out there. There were additional resources poured into the Republican Party financially. It was a design strategy to control the apportionment board. Right? Governor, Auditor, Secretary of State, we all know
in all honesty,
who
John
controls the
Kasich
apportionment
didn't
board.
beat Ted Strickland in 2010 because of the apportionment board. It's because that's the way Ohio voted, and Ohio had been viewed as very much of a swing state. So yes, apportionment works, but also if you look at states, it changed a bit in the 2020 election, but 2018, I think California had a district plan that yielded, I think it was 87% Democrat members of Congress in that largest state in the union. So redistrict and reapportionment, both sides play that game, and both of them do it pretty well, sometimes too well.
Well, if you look at the 2020 election results, leave aside the presidential race, and if you look at the U.S. House, it was a very good night for the Republicans, when the expectation was that the Democrats were going to pick up 15 seats, and they lost a lot of seats. And there was the expectation that night, an election night, not runoff day in Georgia, that on election night they were going to win the U.S. Senate. And they didn't win a number of seats they were hoping to win. And the Democrats were hoping to flip a number of state legislatures, and they did not. So actually, election night was a very, very good night for the Republicans. And probably, obviously, for the country, with Trump being out of office, that was the icing on the cake for the country. But otherwise, it was a really good night for Republicans. So now the question becomes: you look at the future of the Republican Party. A lot of people will say, well, the upcoming midterm election, the historical pattern is that the party out of power, will gain seats. Well, it'll take very little to change the control of the House or the Senate, so that's going to be a major battle. But really, the issue out there is, what about Donald Trump, and what about the groups that are the most vocal right now in support of him, and the groups that were actually most instrumental in the insurrection at the Capitol? And so this gets really to the question of the Republican brand, if you will, and that look, as you look forward, there certainly is lots of room and need for what I will call a governing conservative party. But a governing conservative party actually believes in the institutions of the United States and the Constitution. And certainly that was not President Trump's mantra. And the most visible and vocal people now are downright scary. So what will Republican leaders do over the next 2 years to try to remove some of the, and I'll call it a stain actually, of these terrorist right-wing groups, because it really is part now of the Republican legacy. I think they have a wonderful opportunity to do that, but will they do that? Will they be able to have a declaration of independence from Donald Trump and these groups? Will they have their sister soldier moment, if you will?
The first thing they need to do is they need to start telling the truth. And you look at people like Senator Portman, who came out, and what did he want? He wanted a blue ribbon commission to look at voting integrity. Well, we had 61 court cases, and Donald Trump lost 60 of them, some by judges who he appointed, and he put the vice president in charge of some sort of voter suppression, voter fraud commission that found nothing. And then we have people who are viewed as sane and moderate, and I think Rob Portman did himself some pretty serious damage during this election by propagating the lies, repeating the lies. And when I saw his blue ribbon commission, I thought, oh, this is code for voter suppression. The Republicans under Trump lost the House, the Senate, and the White House. I know things are close, and I know that could change in 2 years, but they lost everything. And they lost everything because, as Ray says, we put the most unqualified person in the history of America in charge of our country, and democracy held. Okay, so the Republicans are going to have to decide what kind of party they want to be. And those conversations are happening right now, but the loudest voices continue to be the violent people, the racists, the bigots, and it's going to be a wild ride for the Republicans.
It's interesting. There was a woman on CBS News who referred to herself as a Trumplican. So, that's really, I think, the part of the discussion that the Republican Party has to have. Is there the Trump Party and the Republican Party, or?
You can't be the party of Lincoln and the party of Trump at the same time.
But the reality, I'll point right here in Ohio, if you look at Mike DeWine and the job he's done, Rob Portman, Sandy might not like him, he might not say everything everybody wants, but he's up next year. Are the Democrats going to put up a known and formidable candidate? Mike DeWine's going to run for re-election, and based on the polling I've seen, he's viewed as doing an outstanding job. Some would say on COVID he might be the best governor in the state. The media nationally goes to him all the time to see what he's saying, what's happening in Ohio. So part of it, the image of the Republican Party, you might say it's about this person or that person of the past, but it's also about where are you at for the future. Because I remember a guy named Jim Rhodes was governor of Ohio for 16 years, and he said, people don't care what you did for them yesterday or today. What are you going to do for me tomorrow? They're looking for where are you headed, where are you going? And I think that's the important thing. And if the Republican Party's got a better plan, better performance, better direction, that's going to make the difference. If the Democrats perform better, they'll be rewarded accordingly.
But doesn't somebody have to say these people who are storming the Capitol, destroying the Capitol building, they don't represent us?
Well, but most people, if you looked at what Pence said on the floor of the Senate, you looked at what Mitch McConnell said on the floor of the Senate, basically said this is un-American, this is outrageous.
It took them a minute to get there.
But the violence is, the people ought to be prosecuted, whether it's there or in Portland, Oregon, before or after the inaugural.
But the challenge really, Terry, though, is the whole question of truth And so it took many Republican leaders a long time to acknowledge that we had a legitimate election. We had an honest election. And the danger of their comments and their delays, and also the danger of media like Fox News, when you look at public opinion polls, you still find today that the vast majority of Republicans think the election was rigged. That's a miserable way to begin a new administration, and it's also something then that probably scares a lot of Republican incumbents who realize that there really are still many Trump supporters in their electorates. These Trump supporters aren't necessarily right-wing crazies or violent extremists or anything like that, but they still believe the president. That's going down gradually now, and that may make them less courageous in telling the truth as we go forward. And so, when people finally acknowledge that Joe Biden was legitimately elected and it took them almost 2 months to get there, that was not good for the country. And I'd be saying the same thing, obviously, if the situation were reversed. But we did have some very controversial elections in 2000 and 2004, and Democrats actually did a better job of acknowledging the legitimacy of the Republican victors in a timely fashion, which does promote some kind of national healing. So I understand why Republican incumbents are a little nervous, and I'm sure many of them in their hearts, or in their minds, maybe in some cases, might want to do something a little different, but they're still scared. And they're on the ballot, some of them are on the ballot in 2022.
And I think what we're going to see, or what we likely will see, is some of these knuckleheads in the Republican Party doing a primary challenge against Rob Portman or Mike DeWine. I mean, those elements still exist. They are still encouraged. There was a sizable chunk of our congressional delegation who voted in favor of challenging the validity of the election. I was pretty stunned by how many people did that.
Yeah.
Portman I used to like him, and until this election.
Me too.
And Rob Portman just turned into Jell-O. I mean, he's just not been strong. And it's sad to look at elected officials who all they can focus on is, how do I stay here? I'm here, how do I stay here forever? He ought to be thinking about moving on in a very definite way. And so rather than to think about, let's have some well-known Democrat and people know what his name is and he has resources and all of it, I don't think that's where the people are. The people aren't there. The people want fresh faces. They want to hear somebody who's speaking the truth, someone who understands their circumstance, their situation. And I'm not talking about the wealthiest in America. I'm talking about those who are struggling every day. I like to talk real. So a guy like Kevin Boyce here in Columbia, who's been a state representative, who's been a statewide office holder, the only African-American statewide office holder at that treasurer level. Well, I think we had Ken Blackwell. We try to forget about him. But you come up with some people that the public will say, he's bright, he's fresh, he's got some new ideas. I don't know who he is, but I like what he says better than what I'm hearing over here.
Ray, are you announcing to run for U.S. Senate against Portman?
Well, I'm overqualified.
Wow.
Hey, Ray, I've got my candidate for U.S. Senate for the Democrats,
Who's that?
LeBron James.
I like him,
wow.
or Amy Acton.
Is he a California resident?
No,
We'll take him back.
no, he's kept his commitment to Akron and to Ohio.
Yeah, he's pretty.
He'd be great.
Guy. He's awesome.
All right, we're dropping names here.
So this is how we start these things. Isn't it?
Right. That's right. I heard. So we'll move to questions from our live stream audience in just a few minutes. I do want to ask you all to kind of weigh in on the unity that we've heard President Biden say he wants to move to. And this will be a really good question for Casey, for Terry, since you consult, but I want everybody to talk about if you were tapped to be the consultant for this administration on where you start with that, where would you start? So I'm looking at you, but I'm going to let Sandy start with that.
Well, I think he's doing everything the right way. He's identifying the big problems that we all have to agree are problems, and we need to address them quickly. And I think he is setting up the Republicans to be tagged as obstructionists if they don't play ball and help us with these important problems now. How can you disagree with the need to feed people, clothe people, put a roof over people's heads? And there are so many people who are in those circumstances that it's a shame that this is happening in a country like America.
So unify there
Yep.
on both sides. Okay, that's what you would say.
Yep.
All right, Terry.
Well, as I said earlier, it's all about policy, and I'll give you an example. One of the first things he did before he was president is say he had a $1.9 trillion plan on COVID. And I think legitimately anything more to fix unemployment, COVID vaccine distribution, production, everybody's for that if we really need it. But to put in that bill also a $15 minimum wage, that's something where there's some legitimate policy disputes and questions, because in a New York or an LA, a $15 minimum wage might make sense, or we might already effectively be there in the marketplace. But there's other parts of the nation where the cost of living, the market structure is totally different. So when you intermix ideas, and first is 1.9 billion, I mean, it's nice to get checks from the federal government. I'm happy to take them, but to be honest, I and a lot of other Americans don't really need it. The question that senators like Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, says, should we target the aid to the people most in need instead of just trying with a fire hose to send billions and billions of dollars out to everybody? So there's legitimate policy questions. That's the thing where if you really are for unity, that's where you figure it out and where you focus, instead of just trying to satisfy one part like the Green No Deal or DC statehood, packing the Supreme Court. There's other issues that maybe Biden supports, maybe he doesn't. He's been unclear where he's at on some of those issues.
Unity is, if we mean by unity, widespread agreement at a very high percentage level, that's not going to happen. But what we're really talking about first is, can we in the next month pass a COVID relief bill that focuses on health, the economy, and getting kids back into school? Can we do that? It won't be a $1.9 trillion package when it's finally over. There'll be negotiations. Will that bill be able to pass with a bipartisan, not unanimous by any means, but, some reasonable number of Republican votes in the Senate and even some Republican votes in the House? And if that happens, many people will say, oh, I see what you mean by Joe Biden trying to bring people together and trying to build some coalitions. And yeah, that makes some sense. And that might be a first step. Then, you'll take on some other issues. And some of the issues, will be, well, what do we do about cybersecurity and domestic terrorists? And there's not going to be a lot of dispute about that. And immigration, one of the things he can do is say, the Senate in the past had a bipartisan, let's put together a bipartisan group and try to say to Marco Rubio, Marco, let's get back to what you used to think about. And I think there are opportunities. Now, if the COVID relief thing comes crashing down, then I think we're all going to be saying, oh my God, it's going to be 2 years, 4 years of gridlock. So I think it's very important. And then the question of unity at the mass level, citizens, I think we need to see that, even as I cited before, that many Republicans still believe that the election was stolen. Many of them are also still saying, we wish President Biden well. And so I think maybe some successes might start building greater confidence in American institutions. And yeah, there are going to be differences. I mean, Terry I'm giving sort of the optimistic view, and Terry will pick out this versus that. But one of the things that Joe Biden did during the campaign, they asked him about the Green New Deal. He said, it's in your platform, your party, a lot of people in your party support it. And he said, I'm the nominee, I don't support it. End the discussion. Now, it may come up again and again, but, well.
Right.
Yeah, time has a way of clarifying things and certainly clarifying history. We're sitting here, and there will be some people who say, well, they haven't said very much about that insurrection that occurred a few days ago on January the 6th. In time and in history, we're going to look back and say that happened in the United States of America, where they took over the Capitol. 5 people died. You had, like the Civil War, you had in large measure white people fighting against white people. And a number of us are sitting back saying, why are they so mad, right? Why are those people so mad when it's African Americans that are suffering and people, Hispanics and other people of color, throughout this country? So history is going to clarify some things. I think Joe Biden is all about unity. I think he's not, he's 78 years old. He doesn't have time to run games, right? And so, Biden is dead serious about unity. I think he knows how to bring it about. He has Kamala Harris, as his vice president. Things are lining up extremely well. I'm not going to talk about the various caucuses within the Congress of the United States, like the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, Joyce Beatty is now the chair of the caucus. The former foundation chair is Joe Biden's special assistant on minority affairs, Cedric Richmond. And so, things are lining up extremely well. That's going to enable us to make some change, I think, in a shorter period of time than normal.
All right, thank you. All right, so we have some questions from our viewers.
We do. We have a lot of really
Audience.
good questions. I'm going to combine some of them. And I have a couple questions on Trump. I'm going to get that one out of the way first, and then we can go on to some futuristic things. Bill Lafayette from Regionomics asks, what will be the future role of Trump in the Republican Party? And Zima Gelman asks, what are your thoughts about Trump wanting to form a new Patriot Party?
I was asked the Patriot Party question on a radio thing earlier this week, and my view is it's kind of like Trump starting Trump TV or his own cable network. In order to do that, the legal costs, the legal steps required are very formidable, the amount of money it would take. My sense is the way Trump went out as president, including the fiasco in the Georgia special election and the other kind of things, his sinking poll numbers, my sense is he's going to be busy playing golf in Florida. He can't be on Twitter. So my sense is, to a certain extent, by his own hand, he's solved a bit of the problem, and I think it'll make it easier to move ahead and transition. He'll still have opinion, he'll still have comments, but it's not the same thing that it might have been or could have been, because, again, starting your own political party, starting your own cable TV network, you just can't snap your fingers or put out a tweet and make that happen.
He's also in store for a long string of bad news, because there's all sorts of things that he did that he didn't get caught doing that the Biden administration is going to out him for having done. And I think that's going to hurt the brand as well. And in addition, Trump is going to be busy because there are all sorts of people trying to prosecute him, his organization, his children. So he's going to have other things to keep him busy.
So this leads a little bit, Terry, what you said. Richard Needles from Productive People Strategies. How should social media companies allow for free speech while not supporting or allowing dangerous activities?
Wow, that's an incredibly substantive policy question where, if you've watched in the last year, Democrats and Republicans in House and Senate committees have grilled these social media people, and most of them have been like politicians, giving you pretzel-like twisted answers that don't really respond to anything. So I think that's something legislatively that's got to be considered, because on one hand, conservatives say they're private companies, so they've got rights to do what they want. But on the other hand, they're arguably operating as monopolies on not necessarily the public airwaves, but the internet is kind of like some of the public airwaves. So there's some serious legal questions, and Congress, if they ever focus and get serious, they ought to address these.
But the answers are not at all obvious. And when these companies say they're private companies, therefore First Amendment issues don't really apply to them, when you look at this more broadly, we do know that social media has been a major contributor to the expansion of, awful groups on the right and on the left, and how do you handle that? And there may not be any easy answer except to say you may have to self-police, and then if you really tick off people, the Congress might intervene. But I'm not sure I'm going to count on the Congress on this issue to give us a resolution.
So I have a follow-up question to that. Free speech allows you to have free speech. It doesn't necessarily allow you to have free speech on any platform. If you wanted to say something in the Columbus Dispatch, you'd have to buy an ad. If you wanted to say something on WBNS or other TV, you'd have to buy an ad. But yet the internet provides free speech on a free platform. Is that one of the issues that will be dealt with?
Well, that's part of the tangle. It's like newspapers. I've dealt with newspapers in the past where they wanted to rewrite our newspaper ad we were paying for. But the key thing is the First Amendment says Congress shall not do things, but there's serious antitrust issues, and clearly the telephone company and the cell phone people don't listen to your phone calls and then jump in and say, we don't like what you're talking about, we're going to cut you off. So there's a serious question of, are these social media companies operating on the internet created by the federal government? Are they really a common carrier? Are they something that could be regulated? And again, there's some really serious monopoly antitrust questions that those companies are facing in terms of how they operate and what they do.
Lee Martin, I
Just
believe.
very quickly comment, I think I have to, as a publisher of the finest newspaper in North America. And our paper is free, by the way. And people say, Ray, how do you put out a free newspaper? With advertising. If you don't have advertising, you're not going to be able to publish and distribute. But I do want to say a word about solutions. And on this point that you raised. Very quickly, what I would do is to convene the brightest members of the Congress, maybe 8 to 10 of them, 8 to 10, and say, we want you to look at everything that Donald Trump did that was egregious, that really went towards destroying the democracy that we live under, right? And if they look at everything that he has done wrong, now you're going to come up with a legislative package to ensure that those things never occur in our country again. I think you have to have that kind of an attitude, but assemble your bright, nonpartisan, big-thinking members of the Congress to come up with that legislative package. Without that, we're going to start forgetting all of these things that he did, because every day that he woke up, he had something that was worse than the day before.
So Lee Martin, I believe he's one of our new members today. I understand Sandy's disagreement with Portman's suggestion to investigate elections, but how do you address the concerns so that we don't have this problem every election from now on? And I guess I would ask a little bit of a follow-up. Do you think it's part of Portman's strategy to create this blue ribbon commission so that they can address these issues once and for all and get the fair and legal piece of it kind of out of the way?
I don't think there is widespread voter fraud. I mean, 60 courts have looked at it, the Vice President's commission looked at it, and they all found nothing. And I thought this was Portman's way to try to come up with new creative voter suppression tactics, particularly for people of color, because they're voting in record numbers and they tend to vote for the Democrats. I don't give him the benefit of the doubt on this at all. And Cincinnati City Beat, which is a weekly alternative in Cincinnati, did a pretty interesting story where they asked him 3 or 4 times for any evidence that he had of voter irregularities, and he couldn't come up with any because there really aren't any.
Well, Sandy, having dealt and been on a board of elections, there is election fraud, but it's not massive as claimed. An example in Franklin County, where I was involved in the recount in November and December on the state Senate race that was fairly close, but not as close as some I've been in. There were 387 voters in Franklin County who voted by mail and then tried to show up on election day and vote provisionally. And in all honesty, I don't think that certainly wasn't widespread. It wasn't massive. And in many cases, it was voter confusion because the Franklin County Board of Elections made a mistake on 49th.
You guys caught
And
it.
the system worked and caught it. So there is fraud, but it's not massive. But part of the problem we had in this last election, it was, according to NPR, 44,000 votes in 3 states that separated the difference between Biden's electoral college win and a tied even electoral thing. And to be honest, Trump didn't have a big margin. It was, I think, around 70-some thousand votes in 5 or 6 states in 16. So when you have close elections, there's always going to be problems and questions, and it can be sorted out. But part of it is the difference. It wasn't massive, but there is problems and questions and issues that do need to be addressed. And under the Constitution, each state is supposed to set the rules and terms of the elections, not the federal government.
Recount the votes in Georgia 3 times. And nobody would take, a lot of people said, oh, no, we have to do it again. Come on, there has to be evidence.
I understand.
What's offensive about Portman's suggestion is that it gives credence to the notion that there was fraud. And this was not an election characterized by any levels of fraud that could have changed the outcome. There's always our problems of election administration. I would say here in Ohio, we have a fairly good election system. But for him to be suggesting that is a way out of, trying to have it both ways, trying to sort of appeal to the Trump people who believe that there's fraud, but also trying to suggest he's being kind of moderate and thoughtful here. We should always review the conduct of elections. We should always see how we can improve them. But it really is, that was a distraction and a diversion. And that's not even getting into Sandy's point about suppressing votes. I'm simply saying that that's actually that was just a political ploy.
Let's not forget about history as well in terms of those strategies to target population groups that could influence elections. And that's what we're dealing with in this election as well. It's like, how do we stop those African Americans from voting in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and so forth, right, in the Confederate states? How do we stop that from occurring? And they weren't successful in doing it, and so they're not going to stop either.
I've got so many more good questions. I did want to ask something. Were you surprised, and was it good strategy for President Biden to cancel the Keystone Pipeline as one of his first waves of executive, considering the impact it has, as you mentioned, Terry, with 11,000 jobs and the route that it got for approval to begin with?
And people are going to look at the gas pump, what happens to gas prices, and does this help build jobs and energy in the United States, or does it help people in Saudi Arabia sell more oil at higher prices to us? So there's legitimate questions on energy policy and where do we go for the future.
So is it sidelined, or is it dead forever?
Who knows? I don't know legally whether people are going to be able to go to court and say you can't just stop it that way by executive order. I don't know what the legal arguments are on both sides.
To be continued.
Once upon a time, Ohio led the nation in new green jobs, and that was because when Ted Strickland was the governor, he put in these green energy benchmarks that utilities had to follow. So there was a market for wind and solar and other types of renewable energy. The Republicans killed the benchmarks, so they took away those markets. Those were good paying, family sustaining green energy jobs. Those will come back under the Biden administration.
Excellent. I hope you enjoyed today's forum. It is a fascinating topic. I'm sure we're going to be looking back at this one in a few years, saying how accurate were we. It's clear we've got a big hill to climb. So our forum next week will feature a conversation on race, equity, and how all of us can be involved in conversations towards change. Thanks for our live stream support today, presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation, and in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch and PNC, and our online virtual seat patrons. Thank you. A special thanks to our speakers, Sandy Theis, Herb Asher, Terry Casey, Ray Miller, and Tracy Townsend. We hope to see you again soon. Until then, please stay safe.